We continue our reading of Lest We Forget. We have nothing to fear for the future, except as we forget the way the Lord has led us and His teaching in our past history. A daily devotional by author George R. Knight. Today's reading, January 12. Be careful what you promise God. Eli perceived that the Lord was calling the boy. Therefore Eli said to Samuel, Go lie down, and if he calls you, you shall say, Speak, Lord, for thy servant hears. 1 Samuel 3, 8 and 9. But sometimes we don't want to hear. Such was the case of William Miller. Even though the ears of his conscience rang with the command to warn the world of danger to come, he had no desire to do so. I did all I could to avoid the conviction that anything was required of me, and I thought that by freely speaking of it to all, I should perform my duty, and that God would raise up the necessary instrumentality for the accomplishment of the work. I prayed that some minister might see the truth and devote himself to its promulgation. Now there's a handy solution. Get some minister to do our work. I've come to the conclusion that if the church relies on the ministers to finish the work, it will take a little longer than eternity. The bad news about the good news is that God calls each of us to do our part. But that is just what the very human William Miller didn't want to do. Hoping to witness by proxy, he eventually arrived at the Moses excuse. I told the Lord that I was not used to public speaking, that I had not the necessary qualifications to gain the attention of an audience, and so on. But he could get no relief. For 9 more years, Miller struggled with the conviction that he had a task to do for God. Then one Saturday about the year 1832, he sat down at his desk to examine a detail of Bible teaching. Suddenly he felt overwhelmed with the belief that he needed to become active for the Lord. In agony he cried out that he couldn't go. Why not? Came the reply. And then he recited all of his threadbare excuses. Finally, his distress became so great that he promised God that he would perform his duty if he got an invitation to speak publicly on the topic of the Lord's coming. With that, he experienced a sigh of relief. After all, he was 50 years old, and no one had ever asked him to present the topic before. He felt free at last, but within a half hour, he received just such an invitation. And with it came a flash of anger that he had ever promised God anything. Without answering, he stormed out of the house. After struggling with God and himself for almost an hour, he finally agreed to preach the next day. That sermon was the beginning of one of the most fruitful ministries of the mid-19th century. The moral: be careful what you promise God. He may have more in mind for your life than you have ever dreamed of. This concludes our reading today of Lest We Forget.